your teeth. Show your teeth. Show your teeth.
Okay, we on.
Hey,
Thank
wow.
you. Okay, I think you can go to the back now.
Ava lost both her teeth this week,
Easy.
so she's
Fit
a rabbit now.
Yeah, look like a bunny. Isn't bunnies with long teeth?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, horseback, I guess, actually refers to not having teeth, but having those two big front teeth, which she doesn't have yet.
Okay, we are
Yes.
here.
Guys, we are
late,
late.
but we are
We
here.
are sorry. We had it all planned, but my wife made a mistake.
I didn't.
You're the one that
You
said
preached too long.
No. That is not true. But anyway,
We were with our friends this morning at Discovery Church.
we were speaking there, and unfortunately, it went a little bit longer than what we thought it would. So we thought we'd be able to be back home early enough, but it didn't work. So apologies for starting a little bit late. But I know most of you watch not live, so it's not train smash. Come on.
Hello, Wiseman.
Wiseman and Sherelle. Hi, Sherelle.
Hello, Sheree.
Hope you're well. Miss you.
I think that was Alice also watching. I didn't.
Alice,
the
yeah, I
name.
think Alice is there as well.
Morning,
It's okay.
Alice.
Hey, Alice.
And the girls of you with Mum.
And what I am glad about, Tori, is it was raining this morning.
Is it France? Then tell us about that.
Well, you know, wet stuff falling from the sky. And so we couldn't sit out here. We had, we have to go when it rains or the wind's heavy. You have to go into the bar area, and it's not nice there. So it's so much better out here. So for that, I'm
It is
glad.
better. It is better. Hello, Lenny.
Hello, Lynn. Are you back in Joburg?
What do you mean back?
She went to Dubai.
to
She was in
visit her
Dubai
one
for quite a
other
while.
son
Yeah.
and daughter-in-law.
Welcome if you're watching for the first time. If you're not, welcome back.
If you're not welcome.
If you're not watching, don't worry. Forget that. Scrap that.
Yes, if you're not watching, don't welcome.
Scrap that. Raise your hand if you're not here. Righty.
Hey guys.
Guys, I thank you.
It's been so
Grace,
cool,
thank
Dan.
you so
know,
much.
Thank you for your input, Dan. Enjoy you, Dan. You know what? Enjoy yourself now.
Awesome. Okay, Grace. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I got frozen from
Hello, Lauren. Hello, Lauren. Awesome. Back in the cold. Yep. Compared to Dubai, I'm sure. Huh? Joburg must be like Alaska North Pole vibes. It's actually quite
It's cool,
Cool
here now.
here today.
Cold.
but yeah, at least not raining, so it's nice out here. Right, guys, we're going to get going. 3 minutes in. Today we're speaking about making room or making space for the other, and we're going to be going to Romans 14, and a little bit of Romans 15. So, just quick. Paul writes to the Romans. Here you have possibly what's going on in Rome, or the church in Rome, is that you have Jews and Gentiles in the same church, and Jews have a very strict code by which they live, and Romans are a little bit more, whatever goes. So you have collisions, you have conflicts. Growing up Jewish, now you're sitting next to your brother or your sister, and he's eating bacon, and all your life you've been told God says no bacon. So it creates conflict, and I guess Paul is writing to try and solve some of these problems. But in the writing, Paul reveals actually some very, very important principles. And so what we find in a lot of the Old Testament Jewish scriptures is the treating of the neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself, we find in the Old Testament. And that's quite easy when you're Jewish and your neighbor is Jewish.
Yeah.
Obviously it was meant literally at first. It's easy because you both don't eat pork. On Saturdays you don't go outside. You don't expect anyone to go outside. It's Sabbath. You think the same, you come from the same family to some degree, same culture. It's still hard to love people even though you're very similar to them, but the reality is that it would have been very homogeneous. But what you have now is you have a Gentile sitting next to you. This guy's been worshipping pagan gods for as long as he lived. And he's got some traditions and things that don't suit you. But now you're in Christ, or you are, but you might not know it, and there's friction,
Yeah.
right? Things going on. And And now loving your neighbor takes on a whole different dimension. But Jesus actually quite clearly did this already, because Jesus' parable about the Good Samaritan really transformed the idea of neighbor into the idea of other. Love the other. Because the Samaritans, they were not seen as Jews. They didn't speak to the Jews didn't speak to the Samaritans. The Samaritans had a different way of believing. They didn't go to the temple. You might know that Samaria was the capital of the northern 10 tribes. Also children of Jacob or Israel, but not Jews.
Yeah.
And so when Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman, she's so surprised that he would speak to, as a Jew, that he would speak to a Samaritan woman. Because although they are a long-distance family in some sense, they don't mix.
Yeah.
They don't talk. They don't believe the same things. They don't see each other as part of each other. And so when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, what he is doing is he's saying your neighbor is no longer the guy who looks like you, talks like you, and comes from the same culture, but your neighbor now is the other. It's the one you don't like. It's the one you don't want to sit with.
The one is not like you.
It is not like you. Doesn't think like you. Possibly doesn't believe like you. And so that transition from loving your neighbor to loving the other is something which is it's quite unique to what Jesus does. So by the time we get to the Roman church, you have exactly the situation. You have Jews and Gentiles sitting together in the same benches in churches or in households or whatever. One eats pork, the other doesn't. And it's no longer your neighbor, that's now your brother and your sister, but they are other, right? Yeah. In that sense, that they don't belong to the same culture. They don't think like you, they don't look like you, they just don't have the same heritage. So what we find in Romans 14, I think, is a very good roadmap. We look at how Paul deals with this issue, and Paul uses specific examples in Romans 14, the example of whether or not to eat meat or not, as an example, or the other example he uses, whether not to regard certain days as more special than others. Now you know that these two issues are central to Jewish understanding of the law, the Torah. Not eating certain things. Don't eat split-hooved animals, and not to do anything on the Sabbath. So these are core issues. And you would think that at the end of Paul's deliberation with this church that is Jews and Gentiles, he'll convert the Gentiles and say, okay guys, from now on, no more bacon, and on Saturdays take a nap. But it's not what happens. He also doesn't end up by saying to the Jews, no, you must do what the Gentiles do, which it seems like in this case, the Gentiles were kind of vegan, or not vegan, but they weren't eating so much meat, or they weren't eating meat. And they obviously had parties on Saturdays without any issue. So he doesn't take either side, and I think that's at the center of what's really going on here in Romans 14. And can help us, give us a roadmap, or at least some form of a blueprint, a skeleton of how do we treat people that are other to us, the other, that thinks differently, walk differently, etc., etc. Okay, so how do we treat the other? So let's go to Romans, and we're going to go to Romans 14. It starts like this. It says, and I'm going to be paraphrasing this whole thing. It's a long chapter, so I don't want to read it and then explain and then change the Greek words. I don't want to do that or explain the Greek words. I'm going to paraphrase the whole thing. So it starts like this in Romans 14, verse 1. If you consider yourself strong in faith and somebody else weak in faith, right? This is quite something we Christians like to talk about. Who's strong, who's the man of faith, and who's weak in faith. It's one of our favorite things to classify one another in this sense. It says, if you consider someone to be weak in faith, receive that person, right? And then it says, don't start discussions of discrimination. Literally, it means don't start judging that person because you believe that they are weak in their faith. Now, what we're going to see here is, although Paul kind of pits weak and strong against each other, where you end up with, what you end up with here at the end is to realize that actually the one is not weak and the other one is not strong. They see things differently, and it's okay.
Yeah.
That's really what you end up with at the end of the day. But a very strong, and the word receive is important here because we're going to meet it a little bit later again. But he's saying, take that person to yourself. In other words, don't build walls between you and that person because you don't see the same or believe the same. And you know, us as Christians, we're really, really good at building these walls. I mean, we've got 33,000 denominations the last time I checked. That means we have built walls between ourselves because we believe differently and see differently. We, you know, these folks consider those guys weak in faith. These guys consider, nobody considers anybody else strong, but everyone is weaker than us. We got the right way. We know how to do it. This is how you have church. This is how you sing. This is how you believe. This is how you act. And so we've got like 33,000 ways of doing this, and everybody else believes they're better off than the other person. And whenever we meet, our discussions are rarely about love or just embracing one another and receiving one another. We want to convert one another, you know. So Paul then uses the first example. The first example here is eating of meat. And so he says, the strong don't eat meat, right? Excuse me, the strong despise those who do not eat meat. In other words, the strong is actually, to me, it's like a play towards a little bit more of a liberal kind of way, Christian way, or a godly way, or whatever. That the more liberal minded says, you know what, whether you eat or not, it's not such a big issue. But to the what Paul calls the weak, they judge those who do eat. And this is exactly what we do with each other. We're either despising each other or we're judging each other for what the other does. Those who withhold, who are more conservative possibly, and say, you know, we don't do A, B, C, D, and E, they judge those who do. And those who feel that doesn't really matter, they despise or esteem less those who hold to strict codes. And the problem is here is that we're judging one another. We separate ourselves from those people. And we feel like we're better. We feel we are, you know, we are always the strong in some sense. So verse 3 says, don't do that. Don't despise one another. In other words, make the other less or think less of them. Or don't judge people for what they are doing. And the reason he gives is because God has already received both.
Yeah.
So the first instruction is receive people who are different to you, the other. And the reason is God has already received both. Now, we don't like to hear that because much of our religious actions are performance-based. Like we feel like if we do the right stuff, we get promoted, we get blessed, we get accepted better. It is a foreign concept to a lot of Christianity to consider that God is not so much into whether we're eating meat or not, as an example, but that He's already received both those parties, and for that reason, we should also receive one another. So he uses an example. He says, look, can you go into someone else's house and shunt around their servant, tell them what to do, how to do it? You can't do that, right? Why not? Because it's not your servant. And so he uses that example to explain, look, we don't belong to each other. We belong to God in that sense. And that's why we shouldn't be judging one another for our views on meat. Now, I can make this a little bit more relevant today, and we can throw in some hot topics like, I'll play it safe. Capitalism or socialism, or, political ideas. What did you say?
I said baptism.
Yeah. There's some Christians. Christians fight about everything, and we fight about how many times a person goes under the water when he is baptized. Like these things are ridiculous, and we separate ourselves. And it's historically, it's simply true that churches have split because some believe when you get baptized, you've got to go under the water 3 separate times in 3 different names, and others believe you have to go under once in all 3 names at the same time. Petty things that separate us. And Paul is saying to the church, he's saying, receive one another, bring one another close, bring the other close to you, because God has actually already received both. And I think that's maybe the key to this dilemma, is to understand that God doesn't just receive those. Let me put it this way: God doesn't just receive us because we're doing things right. He receives us regardless. And so when we click what that mercy looks like for us, we can start maybe extending that mercy to those who are around us, even if they don't do the things the way we do them, right? Paul uses a second example of the Sabbath, or valuing certain days more than other. You can imagine now what happens. Brother Jew or brother Roman phones brother Jew on Saturday. Hey, come at my house. I'm having a braai, and brother Jew says, "Don't you know it's a Sabbath? Don't you know God said we can't do anything on the Saturday?" And a bit of a row comes. Next morning in church, they don't sit together anymore. They're hesitant to greet each other. Then they start talking. Before you know it, there's a new denomination started. And we have this today. We have, for instance, like we have the Seventh-day Adventists who believe that that we need to honor the Sabbath. Now, I don't personally believe we have to literally sit still on Saturdays. And growing up, we almost felt like they were a cult or they are outside of God's will, and we can't receive them into our church because they don't do anything on Saturdays. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I think from their side, they probably do the same. Oh, those guys, they think they're Christians, but they're running around on Saturdays when it's supposed to be the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Paul is saying, listen, receive one another because God's already received both. And what happens in at least the example of meat or not meat here is at the end Paul says, you know what? It doesn't matter so much. Living from conviction and conscience is what matters as long as you receive one another in love.
Yeah.
Okay, but we'll get there. So in verse 5, Paul mentions, he says, be fully convinced about what you believe in your own mind. And so you get this notion that shines through in this chapter, where Paul's actually saying, meat or no meat, what's the answer? We want the answer. Is it meat or is it not? There's only one right way. But really Paul says, live by your conviction. Live by your conviction, and don't judge those who don't live by your conviction. And this is I won't say it's a novel concept. It is kind of a novel concept to me as someone who's been in Protestant Pentecostalism for much of my life. Because I believe there's one right way, and everybody that doesn't walk that way has to be judged. I mean, I'm helping God. I'm helping that person by telling him he's wrong, and he's, sometimes we said horrible things like, hey, you're going to go to hell because you smoke, or, it's crazy. But we feel like we're doing God's work. We're doing good by helping people
Do things
find
like us.
our way. And what really is going on here with Paul is Paul saying, live from your conviction. Live from your conviction. So he says the point is that God is our judge, right? You often see people tattoo on themselves, only God can judge me. And I think many times that comes from the feeling that people are judging them, not really knowing what they've come through and why they're doing what they are doing. And many times, at least as Christians, we can be very, very harsh in not taking into consideration other people's journeys. We need to become merciful, I think, more merciful in that sense, and realize that we're not always doing God a favor by judging other people and making them come into our camp.
Yeah.
Right, so what he then says is, he says, look, everyone will give account to God for himself and for his own life, right? We're not going to give account to each other. We're giving account to God. So that's in verse 12. Now in verse 13, it says, instead of judging one another and despising one another or thinking less, it's not about despising in the harsh sense. It's more like
Looking down
you
on.
look down on people, like, that person. I know for a fact that growing up in a Pentecostal Protestant tradition, we looked down on people who smoked cigarettes. We did. Even though we'd be nice to them, deep inside, as a kid, when you saw someone smoke that cigarette, you realized one day you maybe be able to help them to be a better person, when it actually had nothing to do with what type of person they were. I mean, you saying this might be drinking liters of Coke every day, and it might be completely unhealthy lifestyle, but that guy who smoked that particular thing, that's out of bounds, and you look down on that. You think you're better than. You will never say that, but that's really the posture that you walked with. And maybe it's a slight exaggeration, but I feel like it is in line with the direction we were kind of brought up. And Paul says, instead of judging one another and looking down on one another because people do things not the way you do them, he says, think about this. Stop putting a stumbling block in front of your brother. and giving him an opportunity to fall. Now, the way I've interpreted this all my life is I look at that and I say,
Tempting.
so this guy doesn't drink wine. So when he comes to my house, I must not drink wine, otherwise he might drink and fall. This is not what's going on here. The fall here is not to eat meat or not to eat meat, because as we'll find out, it doesn't matter so much. The fall here is because you're judging that person, you put an obstacle to the receiving and the loving of that person between you and him.
That's the stumbling.
That's the fall. And so the fall really here is not making someone eat meat that doesn't eat meat, or making someone drink who doesn't drink. The fall here really looks much more like stopping the relationship or inhibiting the love relationship, the receiving relationship, creating a barrier and a ditch in the relationship because of the judgmental mentality and because of the looking down upon, prideful, really self-righteous type of position. So Paul says, look, instead of going around spending your time judging people for what they do and looking down on people that don't follow your protocols, think about what you're really doing to that person. By doing that, you're breaking the relationship. You're breaking the love relationship. And the initial command is receive these people unto yourself. So he goes on in verse 14, he says, look, I said, before you jump to conclusions to think that Paul is trying to talk about whether we should or should not eat meat, Paul goes on and makes it quite clear. He says, listen, nothing is clean in itself. So in this example, look guys, there's no such thing as unclean food. Now this is a shock to the Jew. I'm not so sure what it would have been for the pagans, but at least for the Jews, you can't eat donkey, you can't eat goat, you can't eat pork. And Paul suddenly says, look, nothing is unclean. So Paul is not saying eat meat or don't eat meat. Paul is actually saying it doesn't matter. You guys are majoring on the minors. It's faffing a bad word? No, you're faffing. You're faffing over your protocols, your religious hoops that you're jumping through, and you're missing the whole point. You're building a canyon between you and your brother, and that's the main point. The main point is the love part. So, verse 15 says, basically, conclude. Let me read it quickly. 14:15. He mentions agape, and basically in the paraphrase of this, he says, look, if you do this, you're going to fall out of charity with your brother. In other words, you're going to lose that agape type of godly love, of course, between you and your brother because of your judgmental mentality or your self-righteous mentality. You're starting to walk outside love. And he's saying, don't allow the eating or not eating of meat, the Sabbath or not Sabbath. Let me get into today's issues. Capitalism or socialism, not patriarchy, boy, you could put that in a category, but being a patriot or not, the modern political issues, don't allow those things to stand between receiving one another. Conservative and liberal, those are categories we put ourselves in. And it can build canyons. If when I watch television, I look specifically at America, how political agendas have built canyons between the Americans. And it's not only there, I think it's here as well. We've allowed these things to separate us. Oh, I'm AFM. What are you? Oh, I'm PPK. Oh, PPK. Oh, now, that A, B, C, and D. Oh, I'm charismatic. Oh, I'm Catholic. Oh, Catholic. Growing up as a Protestant, we had a very bad and a low view of Catholicism. There were some really bad things in Catholicism, but it doesn't mean the people are bad. And doesn't mean that everything that is today going on there is necessarily bad. Just the same way they look at us. We allow these small, sometimes theological issues to bring such huge canyons that we are no longer able to love one another. And there we defeat the entire point. It's also Paul that writes in Corinthians that even if you are so spiritual that you understand what angels are saying and you can prophesy like nobody's business, even if you give all your money away, etc., 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 unless you can love that person, you are a symbol that's just banging out noise. And I think it's important that we realize that many times that noise is the bickering over theological issues, the bickering over political issues, petty issues. To us, they are huge, but maybe in God's view, they're just not that important. The most important thing is not to build offense between one another. Right, so going around, I know it's going to sound strange to some people watching this, but when you grow up in a very strict religious environment, you become convinced of certain things, that these things are right. Okay? So when you believe that these things are right in this way, you want to project it onto others. At first, it's just that I want to help. Apologies for that. Seems like we're having a little bit of Wi-Fi issues. I just want to go, I asked Tori to go look that Dan's not streaming ultra high definition on the TVs. But it seems like we're back on. Anyone can give me a thumbs up there to make sure we're still going. Right, everyone all right in there? Okay. Last time we had Wi-Fi issues and we found out they were streaming ultra
HD movies.
4K on the televisions. All right, sorry for that interruption. Lost my train of thought a little bit, but the point is that which we sometimes, what we believe to be good actually is producing evil. Trying to convince people of the right way, which in essence means our way, can actually hurt people and build that canyon and put that offense there so that the relationship is no longer accessible. Obsessing about certain ways of believing that if you don't believe A, B, C, and D, sorry dude, you can't get to heaven, you can't do this, you won't, God doesn't do this, that. We have to be careful of that. Because once we enter that type of dogmatic grounds, we can lose the person. And I think that's what Paul is saying. It doesn't matter whether you eat meat or not. Are you losing the person? Are you losing your brother? Is there still a love, agape type of relationship between you and your brother? That's really what's the most important of all of this. He goes on in verse 17 to say to him, remember guys, God's kingdom is not about eating or drinking, what you're eating, what you're drinking, what you're not eating, what you're not drinking. It's about peace, righteousness, and joy. It's about these qualities that inhabit people. And he says that we should serve in those things. In other words, we need to protect the peace, he says a little bit later on, between us. That doesn't mean we're going to agree with everyone, but we also don't have to agree with everyone. But we can protect the peace. We can guard our own hearts not to judge. To judge in this sense, or to condemn, means to judge down, or to judge that someone is condemned because of what they are doing. In other words, oh, you know, I've seen these oaks, how they did this. Yeah, wait, die blinde some book, you know that. And then when something happens to people who we believe have been doing things wrong, we say, yeah, you see there. And when bad things happen to us, we say, yeah, no, I was attacked by the devil. So we need to be careful that we don't live in a judgmental place or a looking down upon, especially when it comes to dogmatic ideas.
And other people's convictions.
Yes. So we need to talk about convictions, because a large portion of this chapter is about living from your conscience. Because Paul is saying, it doesn't, there's nothing unclean. So whether you eat it or not, it doesn't matter. If you're not eating something that's clean, it doesn't matter. If you're eating something that's clean, it doesn't matter. What does matter is, are you following the strong conviction of your heart? The strong conviction. He goes as far as to say that if you don't follow your conviction, that's missing the mark. That's missing the mark. You should be following your conviction. And I think this is important, Tori, because if there's one thing that the New Testament tries to convey to us, I think, is that God lives in. God does not come at the human race from the outside. He comes from the inside. And I know that we've spent much of our lives, many of us, trying to find God on the outside, trying to find Him at places with others, ingesting. But I think we need to trust that the Spirit of God knows what it's doing in coming up from the inside and leading us in the right direction. And that all God can ask of us, or all what we can ask from one another, is to live from that place of conviction. So Paul says, look, if you're convinced that meat eating is right, then don't not eat. But if you're convinced that not eating meat is right, for heaven's sake, don't eat meat because people put pressure on you. Live from your convictions. Be true to your conscience, which I believe is intertwined with the Spirit of God to some degree at least. Don't offend your brother and sister, or don't be offended by what they do. In other words, don't fall out of love with those around you because they're doing things differently or they're believing things differently. We're all on a journey. We all are discovering. We're at different places in our journey. And we have to have grace or mercy for one another, realizing that each one of us carry with us the pains, the hurts, the successes of our predecessors and our own life, all bundled up into this humanness, the thing that we each are. Having mercy for others is to realize that what they're doing because they truly believe in that. Even sometimes when people hurt you, they're not doing it to hurt you, they're doing what they believe they should be doing. And one of the consequences are that you might get hurt, but you might get hurt because of where you come from. And so to have mercy for one another and each other's actions, I think it's incredibly important. Not to condemn, to down judge, or to look down in self-righteousness on people who don't see or understand exactly like we do. Ending off in chapter 15, just a couple of verses from here. He says, so in verse 1, it says, so if you consider yourself strong in the faith, what are you supposed to do? Most people consider themselves strong and others weak. And so what do you do when you see someone that you think, sure, they shouldn't be doing that? What should you do? Now, Paul doesn't say go and convince them of what they shouldn't be doing. Paul says you have to carry their weakness. Which is interesting, Dory. What exactly does he mean by that? And then he adds, not to please yourself. In other words, I think Paul realized there's this danger, and I think he speaks from his own experience. There was a time when Paul did what was right in his own, according to the scriptures, by persecuting the Christians. He believed he was doing good. And later on he realized that his good was actually becoming a hurt, it's becoming an evil, and that he was actually following what he believed and what he felt was right and was pleasing for himself, and not really what God wanted. And so at the same time, I think we ourselves also carrying others' weakness, I think, is not trying to help them, help, I'm going to help you, I'm going to point you out where you've gone wrong, I'll show you the right way, I'll sort you out type of thing. It's to have mercy for their point of view, to have tolerance for where they're coming from and accepting them, and not allow yourself to be offended and not to throw offense out there by being judgmental and self-righteous.
I think it's about seeing the person first.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's a good way of putting it.
And that's what we see in Jesus as well. When he came across the woman at the well, and before he sees anything that someone believes or says or does, he sees the person. And I think that's something,
I think if you add, if using what you've said, Jesus on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. He was crucified by the other, right? In that sense. Not a neighbor, not someone who thought like him, or, it was could easily qualified as the other. And in those moments saying, forgive them, they don't know what they do, is a way of saying, of carrying their weakness. Realizing that they don't actually know what they are doing. If they knew what they were doing, if they were aware enough to realize that what this is they're actually doing, they probably wouldn't have done it. That is a form of carrying their weakness. And Paul actually does exactly this. He says, as Christ was able to carry the reproach, the despising and the judgment of others, which you include there the Pharisees and maybe the Romans, he says, do the same so love can reign. So if you do consider yourself to be strong in the faith, it is proved by the ability to carry the weakness of others. And that does not mean to show everyone what's the right way. What that does mean, more accurately, is to have mercy for other people's perspectives, to have tolerance and patience also with other people's perspectives. And I think that's what he's trying to say. Why has my screen gone so dark? My goodness. Light outside. Okay. So, and then, we've said it. Verse 3 says the following. It says, Christ was able to carry. We've said that. So verse 5 says, and verse 5 is the strangest one of the bunch, and I'd like to land on this one. I'm actually going to read it for you. 15:5 says, now the God of patience, consolation, grant you to be like-minded one towards another according to Christ Jesus. Now, if you take that scripture out of portion, if you just take that little verse and you pull it out of its context, you say we all have to think the same. We have to have the same mind. We have to, when it comes to meat, we got to think the same about the meat. You miss the point completely of the whole preceding chapter. The point is exactly this, that we don't all have to think the same. Like-mindedness here, according to this context, refers to agreeing to love one another regardless. Like Christ loved us and them regardless. And so, we sometimes try and put everyone in our own box, and I don't think that should be our mission. Our mission is first and foremostly to receive everyone as God has received them. If they feel convicted in their own conscience to change to what we have or what we're saying, that's a completely different story. But our job is not to go and make everyone see the way we see. Our job is to receive people. And so like-mindedness for Christianity cannot cancel out its diversity. If there's one thing we know about God, number one, if you assume that God made the things that are, this is one of the things that should stand out the most in evidence, like physical, hard, scientific evidence. God loves diversity. It's us who don't like diversity. We stick to the motto, birds of a feather flock together. And it's innate in us as humans to gather with those who are like us because it makes us feel safe. There's low risk in that. We never feel challenged by any of it. But in the kingdom of God, that is not the motto, I believe, of God. I believe God is diverse. If we look at the human race, it is highly diverse, and I think that's the way it should be, or the way God likes it. And we need to be careful not to try and push and box everyone into our own viewpoints, because it'll end up causing more hurt, I think, than good. So like-mindedness here is not about getting everyone to believe exactly the same thing. Like-mindedness here is the agreement to love one another regardless of what someone might feel and what someone might think or believe. Protecting the peace and edifying one another is what he says. So there's an active protecting of peace. So a lot of people say, but to have peace, you must have war sometimes to have peace. I think that's a very human idea, and it's nice to be able to justify our own little wars and our petty fights. But I think at the end of the day, war creates war and breeds war. And the only thing it really creates peace is peace. And peace is not an end to work towards, and no matter what the means are, it's all right as long as peace is the end product. Peace is a way of doing everything. Yeah. And that's the only way we will really ever be able to protect the peace. And then he uses the word, and to edify one another. The word edify here means to build one another up, and it's a technical term, and it's even connected to the idea of architecture. And in other words, I don't think it's saying here, smash down someone else's walls and build them the way you want them. I don't think that's what edifying is referring to. But I think edifying is much more saying, how can I appreciate the architecture of that person, the building, the history, the emotional trauma they've come through, the hurts, the disappointments, the victories, and how can I add to that? How can I be a love source or a place of reflection, a place of growth, admonishing one another. Many times we just turn admonishing in it's just turned into another bashing session.
Judgment session.
Yeah, another session to judge.
Yeah.
And then he ends with this, which is also the way he started. He says, therefore receive one another as Christ received us, right? So we end today with the first portion of 14 where Paul says, look, receive one another. No matter whether you eat meat or not, no matter whether you have parties on Saturdays or not, receive one another. Regardless of whether you think that person does right or has the right religious hoops that he's jumping through, receive one another. And the reason is because God has already received the both. Has already, and Paul, in a literal sense, says God makes both stand. So this portion is not a portion about finding out what is right, whether we should eat or meat or not. The portion is about love. It's about realizing that through life you're going to meet people often that don't think like you, and it doesn't give you the right to judge or look down, but it gives you the opportunity to not throw a fence out there, to not put a stumbling block there, but to keep the channels of relationship open and allow love to be present in the relationship. And so to make room for the other culture, the other sex.
And for them, we are other. It works both
Well,
ways.
exactly.
And so you treat people how you hope that you treat them to be treated.
I think that's also a very valid and important point, that you realize that when you give mercy, you'll receive mercy. And actually, Jesus actually says that. He says, when we mete out mercy, when we give out mercy, we receive mercy. And in that portion, it's not from God, it means from people. Die by the sword, live by the sword. Live by mercy, we receive mercy. Not an easy thing to apply, not an easy thing to always think about. A lot of gray areas, but I think the point is that dogma can't lead us, love must lead us. I think at the end of the day, that's where we need to land. Guys, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yes.
And we hope you have a good week.
We'll see you next time.
Next week, we'll be back at 10:30
Yes.
next Sunday.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Cheers.
Bye.